On the nights when the sea rose heaving against the cliffs of Dragonstone, the castle seemed to move with it, as if the old volcano had never cooled and the stone itself breathed. Wind came keening through arrow slits and battenless windows. Seawater flung high as coin-bright spray against the shoulders of gargoyles and the coils of carved stone WRMs. The halls tasted of salt and soot and old smoke, and in the great chamber of the painted table, a woman in red sat with a brazier at her knees and watched flames. Melisandre kept her eyes on the shifting tongues until the room softened, until the world was only heat and shimmer. She did not look away when the visions sharpened. She had known Dragonstone once already. The ash of it, the salt, the memory of dragons that had not lived here in a century, and she had mistaken the man for the Lord of Light's champion. Now she saw a wolf with a man's sorrow in its eyes, and scales around him like falling leaves, and salt and smoke wrapped as one. She had been wrong before. She would not be careful now. Care had cost a child and a king. "You will forgive me, Lord of Light," she whispered to the brazier. "I will not ask, only do." The door blew inward, rasping on iron hinges. A boy, blue with cold and rain, stumbled in, clutching a bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. "We came by the cove," he chattered. "Milady said we had to come in secret." "Gilly," Melisandre said, rising in the wash of heat and wind. Gilly followed, small and sodden and stubborn, with a swaddled infant on her breast and a man behind her carrying a satchel that clinked faintly like bottles. Samwell Tarly was damp to the bones and out of breath. He smelled of wet leather and wax and fear and ink. "They told me you were here," Sam said, pushing sodden hair from his brow. "Or they told me a red woman was here. I saw you once at the wall. You probably don't remember. I'm not the sort." "I remember," she said. "And you remember the night you struck a god down." Sam opened his mouth and closed it. His hand had whitened around the satchel strap. "I read something. I stole some books. A few. And pages. The Archmasters weren't going to help with none of them care." He burst out all at once, voice rising. "There's proof. Papers from the High Septon himself. Rhaegar Targaryen set aside his first marriage and wed again, in secret." Gilly, who had crept close to the brazier without any shyness at all, nodded. "I read it." He wrote it down. Sam swallowed. His face had the pasty look of someone who has not slept in days. "And I have letters from someone else. A boy, now a man. I mean, not exactly a man, he calls himself Bran Stark. He wrote things he could not know unless he'd seen. He named the place. He named the knights who were there." Melisandre held her hands over the brazier's edges and watched the flames lick her knuckles and do her no harm. "Tower of Joy." Sam's head jerked. "How do you?" "Because I was wrong once," she said, and took the oiled bundle from the boy at the door. "And fire is patient with the foolish who return to it." The storm dragged a long tail of rain over the castle, a cataract sweeping the stone stairs clean. By morning the surf had gone from wrath to a ceaseless grinding, and sea-birds wheeled, screaming, around the stone drum. The rising light found Jon on the causeway overlooking the black-pebbled beach, where jagged outcrops rose like the spines of some long-buried beast. He stood with his cloak snapping in the wind and the salt damp in his hair, and Davos Seaworth beside him holding his hood with one hand and squinting toward a knot of men struggling with a boat. "You forget nothing of these currents," Jon said. "I forget plenty," Davos said. "This island will remind you. She's a hard wife, Dragonstone. You either learn the moods of her shores or she drowns you in them." Jon's dreams had been full of cold lately. Not the clean bite of northern winter, but a stifled cold, like snow fallen in a crypt. The message had been simple enough. Dragonglass in the bones of the island, caches in caves, weapons for the long night to come, and he would have come for that alone. What had thickened in his chest as he read the ravens was not the promise of weapons but the strange shape of words that did not fit him. Legitimate, trueborn, wed, names that wanted to claim him. Rhaegar, Lyanna, Aegon. The wind shook him like a wet dog. Davos kept speaking to fill the silence. "Likely no one's heating the ovens. We'll need fires for a proper welcome, salt, meat, ale piping hot, and we'll be lucky to find day-old broth. You'd think kings and dragon lords would leave servants behind. But no. Stannis took most, others drifted. Place has ghosts. Ask anyone. Do you fear ghosts? Jon said. I fear wasting good food on them, Davos said, and clapped him once on the shoulder. We're late for the painted table. The red woman waits. I won't pretend I'm at ease. Jon looked once more at the boat dragging above the swell, the men straining on its line. He had the queasy sense he'd felt stepping from the gates of Winterfell into the wide white of the yard, the day the Watch's messenger had first come, that the next step would decide more than where he put his foot. The painted table was a great oaken thing shaped like Westeros, its coastlines carved with a careful knife and the seas made flat with paint. It had been scrubbed and scrubbed again until it showed raw pale patches where hundreds of Council Ring knights had left their scars. Now maps lay over it in thin parchment leaves, sketches of sea lanes and tide tables, soundings between hidden rocks. On the dais beyond, a brazier burned like another sun. Jon had never loved fire. He had learned to respect it. The woman in red wore it without blinking. You sent for me, Jon said. I call, and who answers is not my choosing, she said with a tilt of her head, a little smile that was not unkind. I sent for the one whose place is here, and you came. Because of what you wrote about the obsidian, Davos said. That I believe. He plucked a page from the edge of the table. Caves beneath the ridge. Stannis had men quarrying it to sell for trinkets, but he never saw the worth of it. Melisandre slid something across the wood, a roll of cracked vellum tied with twine. I wrote to you about a thing harder to prove than stone, but I do not ask you to take the fire's word alone. Jon took the vellum. He thought of Maester Luwin's brown, spotted hands and the way the older man's eyes had lit at a good question, the smell of the library tower's dust. His hands found the string with careful fingers. He unfolded the neat columns of Septon Maynard's hand and frowned at the High Septon's seal impressed in wax as red as a heart. He read and read again. He handed the vellum to Davos, who made a low noise in his throat and then a higher one, like a man swallowing a laugh and a curse at the same time. Sam stood with damp hair and a hopefulness too large for his face. There's more, he said and fumbled in his satchel. A letter from, well, he calls himself Bran now. You know him, I suppose. He says he sees things. He said your mother's name. He said your father's name and that there was a marriage. The names of those who died protecting them. He wrote what no one else living could know. And I have the High Septon's own record. Two things make a rope, my lord. Jon. A memory opened in Jon like a wound that had never fully scabbed. His father, no, Ned, saying you are a Stark, and the quiet in the words that did not hide the distance. A winter rose set upon a stone. A whisper that had never belonged to him. I don't want it, he heard himself say, not to one of them in particular. I don't want crowns. I don't want names that don't belong to me. What you want is wind, Melisandre said. It goes where it goes. You have a use to it. That is all the wind cares for. But men care for names, and the dead care for truth, and the living will soon care for both if they are to stand in the snow and not fall. Truth is a hard guest, Davos said. He leaves little to eat and expects the best bed. Why tell me here? Jon asked. He put a hand flat upon the painted north, where Winterfell was a dark smudge beneath the shadow of the neck. Why not in Winterfell? Melisandre looked toward the high windows, where the storm's light cast the shadow of arrow slits like black fingers on the stone. Because Dragonstone was the first home of kings who took dragons into their hands and then into the sky, she said softly. Because this castle was built in fire. Because salt and smoke and bone remember. The island woke when you set foot on her, Lord Snow. She knows her own. They made the crown that afternoon. There was no treasury of dragon kings here. Robert Baratheon's men had scattered and melted and stolen. What the Lannisters had not taken Stannis had carried north. Davos brought iron from an anchor chain, pitted and scabbed with salt, thick as a wrist. Sam found obsidian buttons in a locked chest where Stannis had kept the remnants of some older lord's mad taste. The castle smith worked in a stifling shed with rain beating at the shutters and the smell of slag in their lungs. And by dusk they had a circlet of hammered iron set with 3 thumb-sized hunks of dragonglass. It was ugly. It looked honest. They called no highborn crowd. There was no high septon to bind a brow with oil and prayer. There were men. An old sea lord with rings greased dark from years of hauling lines and a braided beard salted to white. A gaunt man from Claw Isle with chill eyes and a thin mouth who gave his name as Celtigar and said little. 3 grim men who had followed Stannis south and then north and now south again, and a dozen household men who had slept under Dragonstone's roof since they were boys. There was a woman who had lost 2 sons to Renly and 3 to Stannis. There was a boy with a knife tucked into his boot as if knives could steady his heart. They filled the room with the smell of wet wool and old fear and the restless hush of people who do not know whether they are watching a birth or a funeral. They did it at the painted table, where kings had placed their hands on carved coasts and sent ships to their deaths. Melisandre stood with the iron circlet cradled in red-sleeved hands like a hot thing. She did not speak a long prayer. She did not raise her voice. She said only this: names have heat. This name has waited in cold. The sword you carry was never yours to boast of, and it will not be a crown's servant any more than a crown will be its master. You were given back once by fire. You will not flee it twice. You have winter in you and a dragon who has forgotten he was a shore bird. Bend your head. He bent. He thought of a cold hand closing around his hair and a man's voice saying traitor and the world going black. He thought of standing in a courtyard with his fathers. No, with Ned's, hand heavy on his shoulder, the night they had looked up to see stars through the Lichyard snow. He thought of burying a child. He thought of wolves. When the iron circlet came down on his brow, it was cold. The dragonglass bit his skin lightly, not enough to break it. He let out a breath that seemed to have waited behind his teeth for years. He had never been a king. He would not be a king now unless the word meant nothing more than the work before him. He straightened and looked along the table to the painted south. The old sea lord knelt first, with bones that creaked like rotted rigging. Driftmark, he wheezed, for the blood and the salt. The man from Claw Isle bowed stiffly. Celtigar, he said, for the law and the ledger. A woman with one hand knelt, fist pressed to her breast. For the dead, she said, that they should not rise again. Davos, who had never knelt to any crown but quiet honesty, put his hand to his heart and did not pretend piety. For the living, he said roughly, that they should have a place to stand. Sam did not kneel. He stood, eyes bright, and whispered, for the book that will be written afterward. And the boy with the knife in his boot, who had never seen a king and had no particular fondness for them, eased down to one knee and muttered, for the food being hot. John Aegon, though the name scraped him raw, felt the weight of the iron and the weight of all of it settle upon his head, which was only a man's head, and nodded. The storm had exhausted itself toward morning. It left the sea looking wrung out and mean. The sky was a low lid of pewter and the gulls looked like torn paper. Davos was showing the smith's men where to lever stones aside for the path to the caves when the boy from the gate came yelping upward as if the wind had lifted him by the scruff. Ships, he shouted, a forest of them, and wings. The courtyard boiled with men and women squinting up into a pale sky as shadows scythed over stone. The dragons announced themselves by the slack-jawed silence of everyone who saw them. The first was black and red as freshly broken iron, wings blocking the sun, light skating along the long bones of a body built for sky. The second, green and bronze, was the color of a wave with light in it. The third was cream pale, his wings mottled like smoke. They circled once, twice on the coastal wind, matching the island's contours as if it had taught them. Then they banked in a great loop and stooped toward the causeway like falcons to a glove. Davos said a prayer to 7 gods he had not visited in some time. Sam made a sound that was not quite a word. Melisandre stood in the open, hair blazed to copper by the light, and did not blink. The column of soldiers that swarmed through the arch told him at once that these were not simply raiders grown bold. They moved like one thing, spears at a perfect angle, shields married edge to edge. Their helms were smooth and impersonal. their faces calm as river water. The woman who walked at their head did not seem to notice the wind try to lift her hair or the dragon that settled on the parapets and clawed the stone to powder. Her black doublet made her look as if she had stepped out of the carved walls. Her eyes were the color of summer seas, and her mouth had the shape of a word you do not say unless you are sure it will be the last in a sentence. She did not look at Jon first. Her gaze swept the carved dragons, the masked men, the painted tables tower, the brazier glow. It took in the chest-high pile of obsidian spalls by the smithy door. When she did look at him, her eyes dipped once, almost imperceptibly, to the iron circlet at his brow. Davos stepped forward and bowed like a hedge knight trying to remember a courtier's ease. "My queen," he said with careful courage, "this island was yours by birth. You'll pardon our using it for a hearth and workbench." "I do not pardon what is not an offense," Daenerys Targaryen said, "and I take back what was never given away. I am told a crown was placed here last night, upon a head that had no interest in the thing." Her gaze returned to Jon. "Is that true, Your Grace?" The Your Grace was sharp as the chip of obsidian fixed at an arrow's point. Jon felt the weight of the iron again. He inclined his head. "It's true I have little taste for crowns, Your Grace," he said, "and true that one was placed." He did not add that it still did not belong to him, that nothing could make it so except work and blood. Her mouth tilted. "Then Dragonstone is a place where odd truths gather." She walked past him, and he felt the heat of her as a shifting of the air. "I claimed this fortress as I left a continent that had been mine and made mine again by fire and blood. But I rose into that sky to see a wolf's paw and an anchor chain crown, and wondered if some of what I learned there had followed me. Names, like the Red Woman said." Melisandre bowed without quite bowing. "Your Grace." The dragon on the parapets, black with eyes like banked coals, lifted his head and sniffed the air with a long, slow draw that seemed to pull smoke from the brazier and salt from the wind. He looked down the line of men and women and the mounted king substitute and found Jon. For an instant, the courtyard fell into the hush of a winter wood. The dragon stepped down, stone screeching under his talons, and lowered his head until his eye, the size of a helm, was level with Jon's chest. Jon did not move, though every part of him wished to. He put out his hand, as he had once put out a hand to a direwolf pup whose teeth could not yet break skin and whose loyalty could break a boy's life open forever. Scales slid like oiled mail under his palm. Heat pulsed along the bone. The big animal's breath blew hot and salt and meat in his face. Jon closed his fingers and did not flinch. The green dragon let out a questioning hiss and folded his wings awkwardly, as if remembering that he had not always been this large. He pushed his muzzle against Jon's shoulder with the graceless insistence of a creature that had once been small enough to fit on a man's lap and had never learned how not to ask for the same things. "Regal?" Daenerys said, and the sound was not command or apology but a small astonishment, as if she had seen a key fall into a lock she had not found a keyhole for. The unexpected softened her mouth. The hard work of conquest retook it. "In Meereen," she said to Jon, "I let men name me Breaker and Mother because it served to make them stop whipping children and selling them for coins. Here, you tell me there is more to you than a wolf who wears a crown to keep frightened men from turning on themselves. You tell me you are the son of my brother." Sam, who had never learned when to swallow his eagerness, opened his mouth and nearly spoke. Davos put a firm hand on his shoulder and squeezed until Sam choked on what would have come next. "I am told I am," Jon said. "I have a name that is not mine and a duty that is. It is the duty only I can carry that brought me here." "Dragonglass," she said, and nodded at the pile of it by the smithy door. "Smoke that hardened into swordstone. The dead don't fear crowns. They fear that." She studied him as if he were another kind of stone. "And they fear fire. They don't fear fire as they should," Melisandre said. Her voice carried without rising. "I have seen a king who walked through flames unmarked and came to the cold in the end like any man. There is only one fear that has meaning, and it is for the end of fear." Daenerys's mouth softened again, but it could have been tiredness. She was very tired, You could see it now that you were permitted to look at her and not be consumed by the knowledge that this person had once walked into a fire bonded to beasts that had burned cities at their lord's words. Then we will mine the glass and make of it knives and arrowheads and spear points, she said. We will feed the forges and the men in their shirts, and then we will fly north. Not yet, Jon said too quickly. He forced his voice to steadiness. We need to bring the north to it. The living must be arrayed or they will fall piecemeal. My sister keeps Winterfell, but she cannot keep men in their places with talk of an aunt and a name. I could not like that. He touched the iron at his brow. I will take this off if it serves. She tilted her head. The light made her hair the color of a wheat field before harvest. You will not. You may never put it on again and still be what you are now, but to take it off for that reason would be to deny what the realm needs. Names have heat, the Red Woman said. Let them warm the hands of those who must hold knives in the dark. You will. Ald have 2 names crowned, Davos said dryly. A convenient warmth. I would have 1 name that is 2 fires made 1 hearth, she said. Her gaze did not break from Jon's. My hand knows the work of seizing. It knows little of sharing. I am learning. If there must be 2 crowns, let them be placed on 2 heads that do not turn away from one another. It was not an offer of marriage. It was not yet the thought of it. It was a blunt acceptance that the old way of one will pressing upon a realm like a boot on mud had made a realm like mud. Jon had walked behind boots often enough. He nodded. First we arm, then we bring the north. First, she agreed, then the dead, then the living. The days tore into a working rhythm. Dragonstone learned the voices of soldiers again. There were unsullied drilling with quiet efficiency on the lower terraces, and men from Driftmark and Claw hauling obsidian out of caves so ancient that their roofs wore the marks of lava frozen in mid-crawl. Davos oversaw the carving sheds with a smuggler's suspicion of waste, made mockery of men who tried to sell him poor arrowheads, and left each workman grinning. Men from the north came to his voice like iron filings to a magnet. Sam lived in a chaos of scrolls and lists, coughing on cave dust, keeping a ledger of coral heads and spear tips and daggers with obsessive neatness, a solace against the knowledge that some part of what he had set in motion would smash lives that counted on days like the ones he had left behind with Gilly and the child. Melisandre moved among the fires and did not speak much to anyone. All work is prayer, she would have said once. Now the heat of her own certainty humbled her tongue. Jon learned the pitch of Dracarys and the slow counterthrust of a spear heavier than a man was made to lift. He learned to keep the crown, that cold iron reminder, on a peg by his bed and not his head, because the weight of it had a strange ability to make a man's thoughts short. He walked the beaches and caves with Daenerys some mornings when wind allowed, and learned how she measured a day. He listened to her speak of cities made freer by her willingness to burn men's livelihoods to ash, and he told her what ash tasted like in the mouth of a child, and she listened. He watched her hand come to rest at her side when Drogon roared and the impulse to command passed through her without answer. She watched him feed choice cuts from the morning's butchery to Regal, laughing when the green beast turned his head like a dog waiting for praise, and he felt something like a boy again. They argued as easily as they agreed, which was not easily. Grudgingly, then more readily, they found that what each would not surrender the other had no wish to take. By the time the first raven came from the far east watch, carrying frost in its feathers and the starved scratch of a hand that had written on a table shaking with fear, the island had weapons enough to blunt a winter. The raven found Sam. Sam found Jon. Jon looked at the words until the ink blurred. Points of blue fire moving at night. The sound a glacier makes when it shears from the mountain. Men with eyes like moonlight and the patience of stones. The line at Eastwatch would not hold. We have to be quick, Jon said. Quicker than winter. If we wait to gather everyone, we gather bones. Dragonfire is quick, Daenerys said. It is also loud, Tyrion Lannister observed, who had arrived with half a fleet and a head full of plans and had spent 2 days drinking nothing stronger than weak wine to make proof to himself that there were things more intoxicating than the rearrangement of the world to the pattern of one's thoughts. He peered at the raven's letter as if it might reveal, on the third reading, a clause that said, "And all of this may be avoided by the relocation of a bishop." Loud will be good in the north, less so in King's Landing. Does King's Landing matter? Grey Worm asked. He had a habit, discovered after he had lost his own language and lived for years in another, of wrestling any question to its simplest expression. It matters because the woman who thinks she rules it will not suffer 2 dragons on one island if she can strike them, Varys said, and the quiet of his voice made them all look. It matters because the Iron Bank has no love for causes that must be fed for years. It matters because the woman on that throne, Cersei, Daenerys said. There was no hatred in her speaking of the name, only weary impatience. She will try something soon. She has already begun, Missandei said, setting down a parchment from a ship spotter in the Skerries. Black sails, a fleet moving under the cliffs to the west. Euron moved like a shark in shallow water. He struck not where the island was strong, but where a fishing boat could slip between teeth. That night his lighter craft slid in like thieves, sailors with claws hooked on their hands to pull themselves up rock like spiders. One reached the parapet, 2, 3, enough to loose ropes and make ladders. It would have gone badly in a world without dragons. This world had them. The alarm bell took hold of the night's wind and scattered it into shards of sound. Grey Worm's men were out of their beds and in their armor before any thought had formed fully. Davos took the steps 2 at a time with a short sword in his hand and another mouthful of curse on his tongue. Jon arrived to see a man in scaling claws fling himself up onto the parapet and gape drunkenly up into Drogon's open jaws. He had time to be a boy again and simply stare. Then he was a man and running, Longclaw coming up in a curve of steel that made a shape the body remembered better than the head. And the man in claws was falling back in 2 pieces, and another was scrambling over his friend's legs to strike at Jon with a short iron hook. Jon's blade found the hollow at the collarbone, where even a strong man is tender, and the hook clanged on the stones, and the man who had held it was screaming, and a dark red streak oversprayed the parapet. Drogon's fire made a straight line of light from parapet to sea. The Ironborn screeched. Euron's heavier ships could not come in, rocks too hungry. His Olish night raiders caught, fell, were blown from the ladders with the wave of wings. The sea boiled where fire kissed it. The old stones took flame and did not care. Men died with their last breath salt-thick and hot in their throats. The dragons held the night until the last hook fell from the wall and the last ladder burned. The attack was a probing hand that had drawn back bleeding. At dawn, Davos stood in a drift of char where fish scales had popped like lamps and gave Jon a look that said he was tired of being surprised by the things he had learned to love. "We can't keep this up with one eye on the sea and the other on the snow," he said. "We must choose. The dead make the choice for us," Jon said. "We go north. We show the north that the dragons are not a southern tale. We make more stone knives at Winterfell than we could hear with all the smiths of the world. We ask help from the Vale, from White Harbor, from every corner that's not already fallen under frost. We leave a garrison here with Missandei and Tyrion to see the work continues and watch the sea. And we leave King's Landing to cook in its own grease?" Tyrion said mildly. "We leave it to stew," Davos said. "Grease has a way of spitting at the cook." He glanced at Daenerys. "Your Grace, I'm a poor hand at court, but I know a kitchen. You can't watch 2 pots and put out a house fire. We argue the north into a plan and throw our strength where it has to be." Daenerys looked past them at the dragons perched like enormous gulls along the outer walls. Drogon, heavier than the others, was cleaning blood from his claws with the patient focus of a cat. Rhaegal lay with his jaw on the stones and one eye on Jon, and the attention in it was the devoted stupidity of a hound. She smiled. "Missandei will keep our accounts. Lord Tyrion will make promises for which I will forgive him later. Grey Worm stays." She turned to Jon. "We fly at dawn." They flew into light so thin it seemed something you might breathe rather than see. The north spread under them like a slow heart, beating on the rhythm of the land. Jon's first terror gave way to something else, something that had not visited him since he had been a boy with a new companion. The discovery that courage is not the absence of fear, but a hand that does not drop yours when wind tears at it. Rhaegal's body rose and fell under him. The harness cut into his thighs and the wind made his eyes stream, and he shouted without words into the void because being alive sometimes demanded a barbaric yawp and winter had no ears for language. They came to Winterfell trailing the astonishment of 100 miles. The fortress looked smaller from above and more vulnerable. A place where men did their best to hold light under a stone lid. In the yard below, people scattered like ants. Sansa stood alone in the space the fright made around her, face upturned. In Jon's chest things he had built walls around since he was a boy broke their noses on those walls again for the privilege of seeing her. He brought Regal low carefully, as one lays a cup on a table that has mattered for your whole life. He slid from the harness with the unsteady gracelessness of the newly returned to earth. Sansa was there before he had steadied. Her embrace was abrupt and fierce and brief. "You fly now," she said. "You always did, I suppose." "The North must see what comes with me," he said. "They see," she said, turning as Drogon settled with a thunder that shook the lintels. "They don't know what to do with it." Arya came like a shadow. He had the same old shock of realizing she had grown twice while you had looked away. She appraised the green beast as she might a new knife. She looked at him with more questions than she had words for, and less trust than he had hoped for, and more love than either required. He put his hand gently on the back of her head. She tolerated it. Later, in the great hall, which had been made into a smithy in all but name, where men stripped the fat from venison haunches beside anvils and a young man. Gendry, someone whispered. A bastard of House Baratheon, a black-haired smith with a hammer and a chip on his shoulder. Shaped river blue stone into knives. Jon told them what they had to do. He told them that Winterfell must become the mouth of the realm, taking in men and spitting out weapons. He told them the dead were coming not to raid but to inherit. Sansa listened with a stillness so complete that it was loud. Arya watched the room, not him. The lords muttered like a stirred hive. Lord Royce from the Vale said humph a dozen times, and once something about practicalities that boiled down to the fact that men must piss and eat and sleep, which had a way of making war more complicated than songs. The Mormont girl, Lyanna, too young and too sharp for the men around her, the steel and brat of their shame, stood up on her bench and told the room they could put their doubts in their britches and sit on them. "The North is tired of kneeling," she said. "It will stand if it has something to stand behind." The words were a slap. The room let its breath out. "Your crown," Sansa said later, when they were alone in the old gods' wood with pines bending under the weight of new snow. "I got your raven. I got 10, from people who wanted to be sure I knew it, as if they hoped their letter would reach me before someone holding the ink the wrong way. I'll burn it if I must," Jon said. "If you burn it to make me feel less pushed aside, I'll take your hand from the fire myself," she said. Her mouth twisted. "Littlefinger tried to make 2 fires of you and Daenerys. He counted on me to be cold. He never learned that cold burns if you hold it long enough. Jon, you know what you are. Tired," he said. "Hungry, a poor rider of dragons. You are a Stark," she said. "And something else that the North will learn to speak of when the dead stop their ears. Wear the crown when you must. Take it off when you must. If someone asks you which you are, you tell them both and then make them show you their hands." "Bran," he said softly, half a question. "Is not Bran anymore," Sansa said. The ache ran under her voice like water under ice. "He knows things I don't care to know. He told me father never." She stopped as if the name had caught in her teeth. "He told me what you have in your pocket." Jon put the iron circlet into her hands. She turned it, studied the obsidian buttons with a look that was surprisingly gentle. "Ugly as an old dog," she said at last. "I suppose it suits you. Will you kneel?" he asked, and they laughed together like children stealing apples. The dead did not pause while the living arranged their lines with the neatness of men drawing maps on tables. Eastwatch shuddered. The first men who had smelled the glacier on the wind came bloated and pale as drift timber in a river, dragging the stench of rot across snow that burned blue under the moon. Tormund sent his ravens and the men under his command. He sent the last hope he had ever put into things like kings, wrapped in words that looked ludicrous when you set them down but were all he had that fingers could do. "Hurry," They are more than I have names for. They flew. The 3 dragons shadowed the snow like storm clouds with talons. The riders, Daenerys on Drogon as if she could have been nowhere else. Jon on Regal with a look gritted into his face like a permanent windburn. Tyrion on no dragon but in a cart with a skin of wine and 10 times as much worry as wine in his blood, went with them as far as the wall. Viserion was restive and cranky, his pale hide shining against the sky like sunlight on frost. When the first ranks of the dead came scrabbling out of the tree line in a skitter of bone and rancid fur, when the ancient stones of the wall caught the white reflections of their eyes like a river on a moonless night, Drogon opened his mouth and made a world. Fire wrote a door in the dark. The first ranks fell and kept coming, as if the dead behind them pushed the dead in front to make a bridge of blackened bodies. The living fell back along the parapet, slick with melted ice. Tormund bellowed and belted a dead thing with a jaw like a horse and watched its skull cave with false satisfaction, because what is the head to a thing that knows nothing of injury? He rolled aside as a spinning barbed spear came singing out of a darkness deeper than cold. The Night King stood on a rise of snow, wind flattening the ragged white of his hair. He moved his arm with the careful deliberation of someone who thinks himself a craftsman. What he made this time was ruin. The spear caught Viserion in a powerful stroke of the right wing. The sound was with splitting only tremendous, as if the wall itself had cracked. The dragon lurched and screamed and flailed, and then fell in a long white arc like a stone flung from a catapult. He struck the ice of the river with a sound that seemed to go on forever. Water geysered and swallowed him in a boiling froth. Drogon screamed and screamed. Regal folded his wings, and Dove and Jon nearly tore the harness from his body, hauling him up because some piece of him had learned to love the green beast in a week, and another piece was a brother doubled over with a wound he could not touch. And he knew that if Regal plunged, Jon would be too much man and not enough dragon, and both would be lost. They fled because men who fight the dead must sometimes learn to live to fight again. They fled because Drogon was bleeding from the battered edges of his wing, and the men on the wall had taken what fire they could into their bones. They fled because Jon saw the look the Night King gave the water and knew the taste that would come from it later. Something sweeter than victory, called vengeance. They came back to Dragonstone with ash in their mouths. Daenerys went alone to the highest of the towers and stood with her hand on the stone until the heat leached out of it. Jon put the iron circlet on his brow and let it bite him because he needed pain that was not his heart. He found her there, when the light had gone and the wind had found its tongue. They did not speak for a time. "My children," she said at last, as if testing whether the word had the strength to stand up under this new weight. "I had nothing once. I burned to make a shape for myself in the world. Then they gave me a shape when they broke their shells and the world broke with them. When one dies, some part of a mountain falls inside me. I know the sound," Jon said. He thought of wardrobes and lichyards again. "If you ask me to give you comfort for a dead brother, I will give you only what I have, which is the promise that I will not let his death be a story that ends in the wrong place. I will use his death as a story that opens a door." "You talk like a maester," she said without the sting that words like that might have held once. "You climb to your thoughts like a man climbs a ladder. The dead don't climb, they flatten." He put his hand on the parapet beside hers. Their fingers did not touch. They did not have to. "We need to be one shape," she said. "Not two, for more than swords and more than crowns. If a maester were advising me and I were who I was in Meereen, he would say marry. He would say tie the realm with a rope these men will not know how to cut. The faintest smile. A rope made with more than ink. He would tell me to ignore the old whispers and the old disgusts and the old jealousies, because the Targaryens made a habit of it and the realm did not die of it. He would tell me to be shameless. I am not a Targaryen," Jon said softly, a reflex of truth, and then the taste of the lie broke on his tongue. He felt rather than saw her turn to look at him. "Your name fits you poorly," she said. "Most names do when they are new. They chafe, they bruise. You walk in them until they are your own. Jon or Aegon or whatever name the dead will prefer. Not even the gods expect men to be only one thing." She moved her hand until her fingertips rested lightly over his knuckles. "If I asked you to marry me for the realm's sake, would you say no?" "I would," he said, and felt her hand stiffen slightly and added, "Until the dead are broken, then I would ask again as a man, and not as a king. I cannot marry for any reason that is not the one I can stand with in the dark when the wind makes you think you hear voices in the hall." "You are honest to a fault," she said, and her laugh was not unkind. "Very well. We will be of one shape without ropes for now. We will make a hearth that joins two fires. And when we have beaten back the night and given the realm days again to fill with foolishness, we will speak in a quieter room." They went north with more than plans. They went with dragons and unsullied and men with obsidian laced into their belts and a winter that had begun to smell like something you had forgotten and then found under a bed. They went with the stubborn loyalty of the north, the reluctant curiosity of the Vale, boats from White Harbor loaded with salt fish and bread and coarse wool, and a woman of enormous presence who did not know how to ride a horse and yet did, with the grace of a queen, because Sansa Stark had decided that her place in the world was to be where the line might break and to stand there. The battle that men would call later the night at the hot walls began as all such things do, with cold and waiting, and the sudden shock of movement that looks slower than a cartwheel and is as fast as lightning and it touches you. The dead came in a wave of soundless mouths. Scorpions on the walls spat iron with obsidian heads that shattered skulls and kept going and buried themselves in the frozen ground with cheerful efficiency. Dragons roared defiance into a sky that did not care. Men died. Some rose. Some were put down with the grief-struck tenderness of a butcher doing his work on a favorite ewe after a lame winter. Jon fought as if nothing else had ever mattered in his life but the act of meeting another thing and denying it. He moved through spaces that were not there a breath later. He slipped and did not fall. He lost Longclaw and found it again with someone else's hand still on the hilt. He watched the Night King walk in a slow, arrogant line toward the Godswood as if moving inside a litany written 1,000 years ago. Bran sat under the boughs like an old man in a story. The red leaves looked black against the snow, and the eyes carved in the trunk were clogged with rime. He was somewhere else and nowhere at once, face slack with the sleep of someone who had learned to stop dreaming. Arya crouched in the shadows, small and deadly and full of the kind of silence that makes men look away because they think they have heard a whisper when they have not. 20 men ringed the trees. 5 fell with a speed that made the others realize they had been standing around a candle in a room that had no windows to hold its light. Drogon landed just long enough to give Daenerys time to leap from his back and drag a wounded boy behind a pillar. She shouted for fire and he gave it, a steady stream that kept the worst of the dead from climbing the roots like ants. Rhaegal circled, screaming for Viserion with the same broken question that had been caught in their bones since the river. Jon made for the heart tree because every instinct he had, and they were not all his, not anymore, told him the tale ended there. The Night King moved with the grace of someone who had never fallen. White light glazed his limbs. His eyes were the only things truly alive in him. He raised his hand and dead men rose. He raised it again and scything cold swept the yard and took the breath of the living for a heartbeat that was long enough to murder 100. Jon felt his own breath stumble and kept going because he had died once and did not intend to spend his second chance on a pause. Longclaw met a sword of ice and shrieked like a kettle left on the boil too long. The Night King fought like a man who has practiced all his life against things that feel no pain and then learned to enjoy the way men make excellent substitutes. He was not perfect, he was tireless. Jon was not tireless, he was stubborn. He created space with his shoulder when he could not make it with the blade. He took a cut along his ribs that let in so much cold it felt like water. He heard Arya's breath in the dark of the tree's roots and the sound of her rolling and knew without seeing that she had put a knife in someone's brain because she could time a heartbeat and had learned which one was the last. "Now," Bran said with a voice like bark. He had not spoken for an hour. He was not speaking to them. He was speaking to the air. The weirwood's eyes ran. Red sap welled and froze and cracked and oozed again like a wound that could not decide whether to stay open. A wind came through the boughs with the smell of the sea and in it 1,000 years of men's breath. The Night King's head turned fractionally, as if he had heard his name on a voice he had forgotten and did not like remembering. Jon did not try to think of why. He moved, Longclaw slid under the upraised arm and through the plate of rime like a plow goes under the thin ice on a puddle in late spring, breaking it with a small joy. It hit something that was not bone and was like bone and made a sound like something inside a bell. The Night King turned his face to Jon's, and in the flat winter of his eyes, Jon saw for an instant a reflection of himself. Not a king, not a boy, but a man who had decided to be unbearable. He pushed. The blade went home. There is a sound a tree makes when it is felled that cuts you in half, if you have known a tree long. There is a sound a winter makes when it is broken that you do not hear because you are busy breathing in air that is not a knife for the first time and your lungs are crying with gratitude. The Night King's body came apart along a seam that had never been visible. The dead hesitated like men hearing a joke they do not understand. Some fell, some screamed, some simply stopped, the way a story stops when someone forgets the words. Drogon raised his head and roared a note that was relief and command and grief. Rhaegal answered with a smaller, harsher sound. The wind that had brought the smell of the sea on its back tasted now of marrow and iron, and the old dry smell that comes when a window has been opened in a room where women have sat talking too long. Men staggered. Women laughed brokenly and then wept, letting go of knives they had held so tight their palms looked like maps of little red islands. Jon slumped against the weirwood roots. Blood ran along his side and made his cloak heavier. Bran's eyes were closed. When he opened them, they had that tired boy in them for a moment, and Jon felt the world tilt with the desire to make it stay. Arya climbed to her feet like a cat and shook her shoulders the way a cat does when it has been rained on and refuses to admit it bothers it. "You didn't have to do it alone," she said, and he laughed and then coughed, and then laughed again because there are some truths that have to be carried like a sack between two. They buried their dead. They built fires to persuade the ground to give them up one more time before accepting them for good. Daenerys stood with her hand on Drogon's muzzle and spoke softly in a language that had grown in her mouth like a plant and then put down roots in a new soil. Sansa held the north in her hands and did not let it drop. They stayed a week because men cannot be asked to put on their boots again and march into another war without hours to remember what it is boots are for. In King's Landing, Cersei Lannister watched a spider of iron and rope unfold. The scorpions crouched along the walls like praying mantises. Qyburn's little creatures scuttled. The Golden Company's boots made a polite noise on the stones as they marched. Euron clicked his teeth like a man imagining breaking another's with his tongue. She had a look in her eyes that had always been there, but men had not seen it before because of pity, or because there had been children in there to confuse matters. Now the look had learned to stand up and had begun to command the rest of her face. "They will come as if the city were a table and they could pull their chairs close and decide," she said. "They will find it is a board set with knives." She was right as far as it went. They came with care. They came with dragons that did not stoop to the walls because scorpion bolts can make queens widows, and then the realm must learn to call itself blind. They came with men who understood how to lay a siege like a cloth, so that it fell smooth and even and did not leave a corner sticking up for foolishness to catch under. Tyrion argued for days in rooms that smelled of tallow and fear and chalk before they resolved to do what seemed both unimaginative and best: starve the city while convincing the people inside that the stew on the other side of the gates was thicker. It felt like betrayal to Daenerys, who was to her bones a breaker of chains. It felt like canniness to Sansa, who understood that a city falls twice when you let it fall to its own belly. It felt like cruelty to Jon, who could still smell frozen corpses when the wind picked up. They did it anyway because kings and queens sometimes step where they do not want to because the less ugly road runs through a swamp. The Iron Fleet tried to make a festival of it. They launched at night in their narrow lanes, swarming a torchlit gap in the blockade. Rhaegal showed them what it is to mistake a gap for invitation. Drogon showed them what it is to mistake a sea for safety. Euron's laugh, which had carried too far for years, shortened into a bark. He slunk back under the hook-nosed cliffs and talked about weather, and Qyburn talked about wind, and Cersei talked about patience as if she were stirring a pot and did not mind whether her hand got burned. 2 months taught a city humility. Gaunt children stared at bread carts like kittens at a butcher's shop. Women fought over heads and hooves. Men who had once run their hands over the smooth skin of whores now fingered rough loaves like lovers. The bells still rang because bells cost no flour. The thing that finally broke the long waiting was small. A cart overturning at the fishmonger's gate, a scrap of fight over a sack of barley, 1,000 small angers finding the spine that hunger gives. They open the gates with more heartbreak than triumph because no one likes admitting they are weaker than their appetites. Grey Worm's men slid in like the lead between window panes. Northmen followed. The Golden Company stood like a painting for a time, and then like a wall for another time, and then like men who had made the calculation between coin and liver and decided to keep as much as they could of both. Scorpions cracked and shattered because Lannister engineers had been given too little time and too much fear. Drogon descended only when the arrow fire thinned to nothing. He settled on the roofs like a thunderhead. He breathed once on the empty street 100 yards from the Red Keep, and a line of granite pavers turned to a glassy black you could see your surprise in. "Tyrion," Daenerys said, "go to your sister. Tell her the bells will save her men and her life. Tell her that if she rings them, I will take the city as if it were a sleeping child." "Your Grace," he said quietly. He had dreamed of this room 100 times, and the dream had sometimes turned to smoke in ways that had left him waking with his mouth burned. "Sometimes children bite in their sleep. I am tired of burning men for the crimes I think they will commit," she said. "I can choose not to." He bowed, as if her choice had lifted a stone from somewhere behind his sternum. He went with a white flag and an old sadness to the keep. Cersei listened to him with her head turned slightly, as if a whisper had brushed her ear. She wore a gown that looked like armor and had a face like a blade. When he finished, she looked past him to the window where the city had made a thin, wavering sound like wind in cut wheat. "The bells," she said. "They ring for conquest sometimes and sometimes for plague. Which would you say this is, little brother?" "It could be neither," Tyrion said. "It could be an end to a time that has starved us of the best in us. Ring them." She stared at him a long time, and then she did a very small thing. She shook her head once, as if she were telling herself not to be foolish. "I will not be the queen who rings the bell that starts the music for my own dance on the scaffold," she said. "Your queen can burn if she likes. She has always wanted to. Let her make her world of ash. She will find it is hard to seat a court on cinders. Then you will die," he said, and did not plead. "If I had ever feared death, would I be here?" She said, and smiled as if hearing a very old, very rude joke one last time. "Tell her to fly. Tell her to aim for my heart. She will not find it." The bells did ring in the end. They rang because the Septons who lived in the belly of the building where the ropes fed from knew nothing of queens and everything of mercy. They rang because a child pulled a rope and a man took it from her and did not feel like a thief. They rang because King's Landing has always known how to take small choices from small hands and make history from them. Daenerys stood on a parapet and listened to them and closed her eyes. She opened them and looked down the lane at a line of men with their swords on the ground and their empty hands lifted and their faces naked. She looked along a different lane at a knot of Lannister men with a scorpion they had hung the way a man hangs laundry. And the scorpion creaked as it swung, and her dragon's body shifted, and Drogon snarled and Regal hissed, and a woman 100 yards away lifted a child toward a window where the light fell on its hair, and the child laughed because bells are funny. She let the wind torn from the bells shred the last of a grief that had wanted so much to be rage and found there was not enough of it left. She raised her hand and then lowered it. "Take the keep," she said to Grey Worm. "No burning. If the Red Keep must be blackened, let it be from cooking smoke when someone poor makes soup in its kitchen." The thing that happened then would take longer to write than to live. Jaime Lannister found his way into the keep and up the stairs and into a hallway that smelled of old cedar and rage. He found his sister with a fluted glass in her hand and eyes that looked like a child at the edge of a well, angry at the water for being far down. He told her of ships waiting on the river and the rocks and caves that had been their childhood's secrets. He told her to follow him. She threw her glass at his head, and he did not move, and it shattered and a piece of it cut his cheek and he did not wipe the blood away. She went with him because she was too tired to do anything else. They found the passages at last. They found a wall where there had been no wall once. They stood with their hands on a thing you could neither burn nor seduce and understood what men mean when they say doom. In the courtyard, a boy who had never left his street before watched a dragon fold his wings and sleep standing up, like a horse. On the walls, Northmen looked down and suppressed the appetite for theft. In the throne room, Daenerys put her hand on a black iron curve and then took it away, and the motion unhooked something in her face and the tension went out of her shoulders, and she sat in a chair that had been sold with blood and bought the same way and felt no triumph at all. Jon walked in looking very tired and a little bemused by the fact that he did not feel more relief, and she looked up and smiled like a woman who has found the ends of a knot at last. "We did not burn it," she said. "We did not," he agreed. "The days after conquest are a tedious miracle. You have to count barley. You have to stand men in lines and write their names in ledgers and tell them not to steal and then tell them again. You have to scrape old banners from walls and decide what shapes to put there in their place. You have to feed a city." Tyrion went about it with a relish that made some mistake him for heartless. Sansa carved a winter outpost in the south the way a jeweler carves a facet, with as much attention as if she were shaping a thing that would be looked at by the single person whose opinion mattered. Arya moved like a shadow where shadows were not supposed to be and made men with old ideas careful with their words. Davos found a boy with his hand in a cart and did not cut it off. He made him carry a sack twice as heavy as himself to a soup line, and the boy did not steal again because someone had given him the impossible shock of believing he could do better. In a chamber with a window that gave a sliver of black water and a wedge of sky, Jon and Daenerys spoke not of marriage but of Mason's work and of the thing that had come to trouble both of them more than the bells. "What do we do with the chair?" she asked, chin on her hand, hair unbraided for the first time in a long while. "It makes men behave like fools. It made me dream of burning. It made you put on that ugly ring every morning whether you wanted to or not. We could melt it," he said, thinking of a sword made nothing by dragonfire and a man with ice eyes looking bored under the torrent. "We could," she said. "Then we would have a puddle of memory and 1,000 songs would mourn something that was a pile of old swords hammered together by a madman. Or we could leave it and pretend it has changed because we did not put men in it who are too weak or too strong for such a seat." She laughed softly. "I am tired of pretending and of destroying. Then we make a thing that is both less and more," he said, and she looked puzzled, and he surprised himself by knowing what his mouth was about to say. "A council. The chair remains. It is a chair. We seat ourselves on it when we speak or not. We call men and women from the corners of the realm and say, 'Sit and argue where all can see you. Put words into the place where swords have been used. Make a world where small things can happen in the open and not be changed later by men with ink. The realm will not know what to do with that," she said, smiling. "It will learn," he said, weary and certain. He went to the Godswood then, where in King's Landing the gods were not the old ones but the ones with stone faces and a severe fondness for architecture. He found a place with trees that had tried their best under poor conditions, and he stood under them. He asked the leaves for permission to be more than he had expected to be. He did not hear an answer in words. He heard a bell ring somewhere far away in a kitchen where someone had set down a pot too carelessly on a stove and something had boiled over. He took it as answer enough. The marriage, when it came, was not the rope the maester had imagined. It was a knot that both of them tied at once and then cut once and then tied again in a way that made more sense and would be harder to unravel. It was not a wedding, not at first. A promise in a room with too much light, both of them too tired to have any desire but the desire to continue. Later, when things had been settled to the disgust of men who loved unsettlement, they stood before people and said the words that made strangers into relatives in a way that made the world quieter. Some men grumbled. Some women laughed. Lyanna Mormont cried because she had a cold and had never learned to be theatrical about anything but honesty. In the north, the snow thinned. Children learned to say dragon the way they had learned to say wolf. Women who had fed soldiers for a month with turnip tops and old barley watched ships arrive with sacks of white flour and looked away quickly when they felt the animal in them twitch with gratitude. In Dorne, men came out to squint at the new sun and complain that it was too bright. In the Iron Islands, someone threw Euron Greyjoy's carved chair into the sea, and there was a great argument on the beach about whether this meant that anyone could sit on whatever they liked. In the Riverlands, Men took down the gallows they had learned to put up in the habit of men who like certainty. In the Vale, Lord Royce said, "Humph," and then something about the utility of grain storage that was as close as he came to a blessing. In Old Town, the archmasters sniffed at new books and then stole each other's when they thought no one was looking. The council met in the Dragon Pit, which had remembered what it was for and forgiven the indignity of serving as a place to knot a realm together rather than as a place to show men how easily they burned. Sansa sat with her back straight and her hands folded because her mother had done so, and when someone spoke nonsense she looked at them until they felt their cheeks heat. Tyrion spoke with the kind of care a man uses when he has learned that a tongue is a knife that cuts the man who sharpens it. Grey Worm spoke rarely, and then only to say simple things that made complicated men's lips thin. Miss Sand. I took notes in a tidy hand and smiled sometimes to herself at the grammar errors in the speeches of powerful men who had not been taught properly to honor their words. Davos scratched his beard and asked when they meant to fix the wharves before a winter storm took the pilings with it. Arya did not attend. Arya left on a ship with a wind that smelled of unknown apples, because there were maps with blank spaces on them, and she had decided that a girl could be a red line on one of them, if she wished. Jon and Daenerys listened more than they spoke. They learned to end quarrels and begin tasks. They learned to forgive slowly and punish quickly, and the other way around when the world required it. They slept sometimes and sometimes not. They kept a chair of swords because it had become a thing you do not throw away without making a ghost angry, and they put other chairs around it at a table that was not the painted one and looked more like something you could eat at. They made mistakes practically and did not pretend any of them were divine. They sent food north when the winter lingered there and ships east when the west seemed too full of itself. They had a child who came into the world like someone kicking down a door and cried with the lusty rage of the living. They wrote letters to places that did not answer for months and then did, with long-winded politeness that made Tyrion's eyes cross. On the anniversary of the night he had knelt by the painted table and let iron touch his skin, Jon went back to Dragonstone. He walked the pebbled beach and put his hand to the rock and felt it warm in the afternoon. The caves where men had chipped at obsidian had a tidy look only people who have not labored there would admire, and he laughed. He climbed to the parapet where a dragon had lowered his head to him, and he had not understood what it meant and felt the old scrape under his ribs where scars do their work. Melisandre stood by the brazier in the chamber of the table. She had more gray in her hair. Her eyes were clearer. She did not smile like a person who had been right about something and had not learned to let go of pride. She smiled like someone who had been wrong and forgiven by a god who knew mercy as well as fire. "You made a hearth," she said, not as a question. "We did," he said. "We will have to again and again. There is no once with these matters." She nodded. "The Lord of Light does not love permanence. He loves what is made and unmade in flame. I prefer stone," he said. "Each to our comforts," she said, and held out her hands to the brazier. "Do you know what I see now when I look? I see men cursing at ledgers, women carrying wood, children with bruised knees. I see a marketplace and a courtroom and a ship returning. The future is not a thing made of swords. I cannot pretend it is a more interesting thing, but I think I prefer it." He laughed. He set his palm, without fear, over the heat. Down on the beach, Rhaegal lay with his jaw in the pebbles and the sun on his back, and Drogon watched a boat come in like a dog deciding whether a stranger would have the sense to bring him something he could eat. The sea was full of small voices. The island breathed. Waves fell and rose and fell again, as if practicing the discipline of being ceaseless without becoming cruel. A child learned to walk along the line where the sea had flung up its shells. A woman watched, arms folded, smiling like someone who had learned what it was to prise open a world that had clenched. In the north, the godswood at Winterfell whispered its old gossip to new leaves. Snow came again and melted again. Someone set up a stall under the shadow of the old wall to sell soups that were thick enough to stand a spoon in. The old men and women who remembered making a dinner on less were polite about how much they admired the thickness. They did not need to say the rest. People who have ericized tragedies behind them learn a style of understatement you cannot teach. In King's Landing, The bells rang at an hour that made no sense to anyone who had not known Tyrion Lannister long enough to understand that sometimes men do things because they make his mouth twitch. They rang because a new law had been written by men and women who had hated laws once and had discovered that the best ones are simply sentences about what you owe to a face you will see again tomorrow. They rang because Daenerys had decided that her city was not improved by being frightened into stillness every day and had taken to walking its streets with 2 guards who looked more concerned about her tendency to buy food for children than about assassins. On a night like the first night, when the sea came up and took the castle by the hips and moved it, Jon climbed to a tower and stood with the wind flattening his hair to his skull and the salt making his lips crack. He looked down into the courtyard, and the brazier burned, and Melisandre's face was lit beneath it like a story told about a fire. He looked at the place where an iron circlet had been made ugly so that it would tell the truth properly. He looked at the line where the sea had a different color because a dragon had once breathed there and changed the glass. He closed his eyes and saw a blue rose against a stone that had once been clean. He did not mistake it for a sign. He thanked it for having been won once. He opened his eyes and saw a realm that had not learned all it needed to but was willing to be taught. He put his hand on the stone and felt it breathe. He let himself breathe with it, and did not find in himself the need to think of crowns. He thought of hearths. He thought of the work that did not end. He thought of the time that had been given back to them like a storehouse unlocked. "You never wanted it," Daenerys had said once, in a room that smelled of lemon and parchment. "You never wanted any of it. I wanted a world that did not swallow children," he had said. "Everything else is a way to get there." Now he listened to the waves swallow and give and swallow again. He counted them because counting is a thing you can do when the work has to sleep sometimes or rests its head on your lap and says, "Hush, just for a moment." He counted until numbers turned into breath, and breath into the simple truth that he was only a man standing on a tower in a wind, and that was enough. The night leaned in. The island lifted with the waves. Far off, beyond where dragons could fly and back again before the fire inside them cooled, beyond where maps ended and Arya's knife was making a new line, the dark was still dark. But it was not empty. It had a shape that the living had given it by refusing to make it everything. The bells would ring in the morning for something small, a birth or a market, and no one would think of conquest when they heard them. That would be victory enough for kings who had learned to be men. And if another winter came and tried to teach them its one lesson, they would take it and add to the book they had begun with knives and ended with laws. Dragonstone went on breathing. The sea went on saying its one very complicated sentence. Men and women did their work and loved one another and buried their dead and told their stories and expected to wake up the next day without having to run. It was not everything. It was what they had won. It would be what they defended together when the island called for them again.